The information featured in this program is general in nature and therefore should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance or financial planning decisions, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Thanks for subscribing to the podcast series Property Investing with Margaret Lomas. We hope you enjoy this installment. If you have any queries, contact us at info@destiny.net.au. Meanwhile, sit back and enjoy this podcast.
Hello and welcome to another podcast. In this podcast, I'd like to talk about property and economics. If you're an investor who purchased property during the late 90s and early millennium, it's likely that you would have done well despite where you chose to buy. Property buying back then was pretty easy. All you had to do was buy anything, hold it for 7 to 10 years, and you would have made considerable money doing so. Your yields would have been pretty good too, and would have grown well during the period that you held the property. They were the halcyon days during an era of abundance and lulled many people into a false sense of security about property. In some ways, it made investors a little lazy. Why go to too much trouble when any buy would probably work out okay in the end? Some investors even hit the jackpot on the back of buyer sentiment, making large sums of money in short periods of time on high-end sought-after property. Since the GFC, everything has changed. A clear link between economic instability and eventual property performance has emerged. And while many feel that this has added an instability and unpredictability to our market, I believe the reverse. It's instead provided us with a unique and accurate prediction tool which allows us to pick and choose markets in a way that we've previously not done. Interestingly, when I went to school, economics was the subject that I hated the most. With a degree of certainty, I could be expected to have a doctor's appointment, an interview, or I simply wagged school on the days when economics was on. It was always the lesson which, for some reason, came after lunch, when I was at my energetic worst, and the teacher seemed to drone on endlessly about facts which I could see no use for in the future. Of course, now that I'm living in the future and I've witnessed a global financial meltdown, I often wish I'd paid more attention. If I had, I truly believe that I would have been able to build a stronger property portfolio much earlier than I have. Little did I realise that these lessons would form the basis of how to recognise a hotspot and buy in the best areas all of the time. All in all, I've done pretty well with my property. I've used a lot of instinct as I've purchased, and I've avoided many of the simple traps that many investors fall into. I've never purchased where I've lived for investment, and I've never let my emotions affect what I've bought. I've considered a range of facts and always gathered as much information, even when I wasn't sure why I was doing so, about the area that I was buying into. Now, in hindsight, examining my portfolio reveals that there are very specific characteristics which exist in all of the areas which have been my best performers. Furthermore, these characteristics are economic and relate to the overall financial health of an area rather than its popularity or its lifestyle offering. In fact, on the contrary, many of my best performing properties exist in areas which haven't yet reached the point of becoming a lifestyle mecca. They're simply areas which cater for the very basic of human needs, appeal to the masses, and yet have features which indicate that they're headed somewhere. You could say that rather than purchase the equivalent of the company CEO, which many property investors think they need to do, I've purchased the enthusiastic university graduate who has no clear idea about what they want to do, but a whole lot of ideas and enthusiasm. Sometimes I've even taken the risk and purchased the high school dropout, the one who's bright and ambitious but just couldn't conform. These types are the ones with the greatest degree of growth available to them, as they haven't yet realised that potential which is so clearly there, and so they come at a bargain price. What I'm actually talking about here is really pure economics. Understand the underlying economic factors and you can see whether an area has what it takes to ultimately become that company CEO, and you can see it a long time before it happens. Since the GFC, an understanding of economics has become probably one of the most important tools in the property investor's arsenal. Understand it and how it ultimately applies to and impacts upon property, you'll find yourself buying property well regardless of the state of the global economy. An examination of a microeconomy is an important part of the groundwork that you must lay before you buy property, but it isn't terribly exciting, and being able to draw the link between the information you uncover and ultimate property performance is the skill that you must learn. In addition, you need to temper this information with everything else you know or are learning about how to buy property well. No single factor makes up the decision to buy any property, and it's more the concert of factors which will help you to uncover a good area in which to buy. Where one feature of an area or region is looking promising, other factors may exist to counteract that feature and turn a potentially good area into a poorly performing one. You need to be utilising all of the information and looking at a wide array of factors prior to making a decision to purchase anywhere. And so to an economics lesson, one which will provide that broad backdrop against which you can proceed to obtain more specific information. Such a lesson is your crucial starting point every time you buy. So let's begin by looking at what I believe are the important economic factors and also examine how they influence property performance. Number 1, gross domestic product. If you were to use as a case study a small village of people whose only occupation and income source was to make baskets for the bigger city nearby, you could estimate the level of productivity and whether or not this is growing by considering the total retail value of the baskets that they sell. If in 1 year the village realised $50,000 from basket sales and the following year they realised $52,000, then their local economy or productivity will have grown over that year by 4%. There could be several reasons why it's grown. It may have occurred as a result of the increased price of baskets, and the growth came from inflation, or perhaps more people started making the baskets and so more were sold. Other factors might also have been at play: an improved method of making the baskets, a decrease in the cost of raw materials, and a host of other things. When you consider the overall health of an entire country, it's a little like measuring basket sales in relation to the number of people who are making the baskets. The growth of the economy of a country can be measured by looking at its gross domestic product, also known as the GDP. GDP is a term which describes the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given period. It's often considered an indicator of a country's standard of living. While you don't need to be an economic genius who can interpret economic data, there's a reason why knowing about GDP and its growth helps you in your search for property. Before explaining this, you should know the components of GDP. They are consumption. This component measures all of the final household consumption expenditure in the economy. Personal expenditure is further categorised into durable goods, non-durable goods and services. Consumption doesn't include the purchase of new housing because this is included in the next category, which is investment. This includes business investment in new business and business assets, but it doesn't include the exchange of existing assets, as this isn't considered to be growth. The private purchase of new housing is included in the category. Investing in a financial product, though, is not included in this category because this is classed as saving. This is because if it's counted in investment, it might be double counted. If you buy a share in a company and that company then buys plant and equipment, this investment could be counted twice. The third component is government spending, which is the sum of government expenditure on final goods and services. It includes the salaries of public servants, the purchase of weapons for the military, and any investment expenditure by a government. It doesn't include social security payments. Next is exports, which represent gross exports since these things become part of another country's consumption, but they're produced here. And the final component is imports, which represent gross imports. This is deducted from the figure, since if it's included, it'll then be considering foreign supply as domestic product, and that'll skew the figures. Once it's been calculated, GDP is usually a figure which is quoted in the billions of dollars. This is then compared against the last time it was measured, and the difference is expressed as a figure which represents the percentage by which the economy is either growing or, in the case of a negative figure, shrinking. As a property investor, it's not really necessary to know what the country's GDP is, or even how it's calculated, or what it's measuring. The reason why it's important for you to be aware of GDP is that it expresses economic growth, and economic growth can be interpreted ahead of time according to the GDP figures. Where the country is experiencing strong economic growth, it'll have a positive change to its GDP figure. If we're producing goods and services and the country's spending money on them, and the figure from one measurement period is higher than that from the prior one, then economically speaking, we're turning over and progressing. Where the GDP figure is in decline and lessens from the prior measurement period, then we're most likely spending less, not producing, and so the economy is shrinking. So how does GDP really relate to property? Well, if you've been following any of my materials, be it books, podcasts, or the TV shows, you'll know that for some time now I've talked about the fact that in Australia there isn't one singular property market. In addition to that, you must know that some areas can and do behave counter-cyclically to others and to an entire macroeconomy. It's highly possible that while the country's GDP is shrinking, the figures from an individual area could well be in growth phase. Therefore, considering whether our nation's economy is growing or shrinking isn't of any great value when you're looking to buy in, say, Bathurst, because Bathurst may have a very different economic picture. What is important to know, though, is that GDP can be considered more locally through both gross state product and gross regional product. Just like the GDP, which is measuring the growth or otherwise of an entire country, the growth of a state and a region can be reflected in its GSP and GRP figures. So once you have these figures, what do you do with them? Remember, it's important to access GRP figures as well as GSP and GDP, because what you need to do next is consider all of the figures in terms of the trends and how they compare to each other. The first thing you must know is the area you're researching should have a GRP which is growing. If you obtain recent figures which seem to show that the regional economy is shrinking, look for the reasons why and determine if it's the result of underlying economic uncertainty in that area. For example, where a major industry which formerly employed a large portion of the local population closes, the next reporting period may show a decline in the GRP. Further investigation would be required to assess the reasons behind the closure. It might have been a problem with that industry, an issue with the local area, such as an inability to obtain the right kind of workforce, or even a lack of market for the products. Such investigation will assist to determine whether or not this will be a lasting situation or just a passing phase. Secondly, you'll want the GRP of an area to match or exceed the GDP of the country. Where it's less than the country's GDP, then you could be looking in an area which is lagging behind the rest of the country in economic growth. Chances are good that such an area will also lag behind the country in growth to property values too. Lastly, you want the GRP to be trending upward, that is, growing a little more each year. As a backdrop to the overall economic health of an area, a strong growing GRP may be a precursor to other economic factors which ultimately drive property growth. More jobs, a growing population, and increasing median household income. Examined alone, GRP may seem a little insignificant, but examined in concert with many other factors, a sound GRP should place a big tick on the pros side of your property investing checklist. Number 2, employment. It seems obvious that no one would want to be buying property in an area with high and chronic unemployment, and we should all only ever consider buying property in areas with low unemployment rates. Where there's a considerable lack of employment, an area can quickly become unstable and people can eventually move away. Areas with high unemployment typically suffer from other issues too, higher crime rates and lower GRP. However, it's really important to note that a high unemployment rate doesn't always spell trouble, and employment data needs to be examined for both its rate in relation to the national average and for its trend. An area with unemployment rates lower than the national average is an area which also has economic vibrancy. That being said, it's important that a thorough examination is done of what this employment represents, so that the concert creates beautiful music over the long term rather than just a fabulous show for the short term. Strong employment where there's only one major industry can be a worse choice than an area with higher unemployment rates but a diversified industry base. In such areas, everyone may have a job when you're looking to buy property there, but many of those people wouldn't have a job if that one industry suddenly failed. On the other hand, strong employment over a diverse range of industry types is a sure sign that the economy is vibrant and able to withstand short-term issues such as closure or stagnation of a single industry. A strong employment figure, which is also underpinned by jobs growth showing a downward trend in the unemployment rate, is even better. Remember, you're seeking an area which is more than just stable. You want it to be about to become a hotspot. Where employment is on the increase and jobs are growing, other factors often follow. Population grows, there's pressure on rents and eventually on house prices. In addition to that, the more jobs there are, the more productive an area becomes. Productivity often translates into spending, and as long as the services exist to meet the demand from the demographics of an area, that spending is likely to occur within that area. If a population is able to cycle its wealth back into its own microeconomy by earning and spending locally, this is a further boon to GRP growth. As an aside, I should raise an interesting phenomena which seems to be emerging from mining towns. While workers in mining towns are fully employed and paid very well, often the microeconomy of those areas is weak. A recent study as to why has revealed that the incidence of fly-in, fly-out workers in such towns has resulted in the money earned being taken out of the local economy back to the hometowns of the workers. And while property in such areas tends to skyrocket in value, the underlying economy is flimsy and has a significantly increased risk. A single factor, such as a new tax, can send such an economy plummeting, taking property values and yields with it. Number 3, jobs growth. Aside from underpinning continued employment growth, jobs growth has another often ignored impact on the economy as a whole. When jobs are becoming less available, employees tend to remain in their jobs longer. When there isn't much work about, this is a sign of a slowdown in the economy. Employers begin to rationalise costs, cut jobs, and expect each worker to become more productive. Employees wanting to keep their jobs may work longer hours and ask for fewer pay rises. The cycle gradually grinds to a halt and the situation impacts back on the greater economy. Conversely, when job availability is growing, employees have more choice. They begin to exercise this choice by applying for and moving to better or more diverse positions, and employers find staff turning over. Since the cost to employ and train new people is often great, the preference is to retain the employees that they already have. The best way to do this is through wage increases. And as job vacancies grow, so does the collective wealth of the country. People earn more, spend more, and become more able to manage and plan for interest rate rises. Businesses produce and provide more to meet this improved demand and begin to pay more to their employees who spend it back on those same goods and services. Property becomes more affordable, not because its value drops, but because wages are on the increase and buyers can afford to support larger loans and pay higher rates of interest, removing a large impediment to house price growth. As with all of these economic factors, jobs growth can occur locally, even in the face of a national decrease in availability of work and an increase to unemployment. Typically, we see this occurring in those areas where other significant growth drivers exist: strong infrastructure development, a diversification of industry, and the provision of improved services to local residents. As a barometer to the overall economic health of an area on a micro level, jobs growth is an excellent indicator of improving economic vibrancy. Number 4, industrial and commercial property markets. You probably think that you'll never want to purchase a commercial or industrial property, and therefore their performance isn't relevant to you. However, the role of the performance of such property plays in improving the economic potential of an area shouldn't be overlooked. Where commerce is strong, companies large and small often spend their money on commercial real estate, preferring to own than rent. This creates a demand for commercial and industrial space, which impacts on prices. Where the value of industrial and commercial property is growing generally, signs exist that indicate that the underlying economy is in a prosperous phase. Commercial and industrial properties are generally valued according to the yields they can bring. Basically, if a commercial property can bring high yields, its value will grow. Where the yields fall, so does the value. While this is contrary to residential markets, where the value is not usually impacted by the volatility of yields, what is common between the two is the fact that it will be demand from tenants which drives the yield growth or not. If commercial property is in demand, this will usually be an indicator that business in general is thriving. More people getting into business will create more demand from commercial and industrial space. On a more local level, where the demand for commercial and industrial space is pushing up yields, the indications are that business is growing, either from within or as a result of large companies moving into the area. Business growth equals jobs growth, and jobs growth equals economic vibrancy. Now, of course, it goes without saying that economic vibrancy then translates into an area becoming more populous, more affluent, and especially if there's already a shortage in housing, property prices will then grow. Number 5, housing starts. This is a term which refers to the number of new private dwellings where construction has commenced in a given period. It's most often measured quarterly. As a measure of economic health, an increase in housing starts over 3 to 4 measurement periods is usually a good sign that the economy is coming out of the doldrums and is once again in growth phase. However, for property investors, by the time such a statistic is measured and reported, that window of opportunity to buy into a potential hotspot might be lost. From your perspective, you want to see reports of low housing starts in the face of positive economic indicators elsewhere. Where the low figures relate to high unemployment, low population growth, and slow growth for business, then this could be an indicator of a declining or stagnant area. But where an area shows economic vibrancy and low housing starts, it's definitely a big tick in the pros column of your hotspotting checklist. Number 6, growth in overseas visitors. I'm sure everyone's been in the position of having a lovely, relaxing weekend somewhere or going on a great domestic holiday and complaining about the influx of overseas visitors, seemingly interrupting what would otherwise be perfect peace. It can be hard to think otherwise, but overseas visitors play an important role in our economy. When an Australian resident spends money on goods and services, the money they use to do this has come at a cost to earn. The original dollar first of all funded the cost of production of the goods or provision of the services. Then it incurred taxes and bills were paid from it. Finally, what's left of the dollar is spent and injected back into the economy. When an overseas visitor spends money in Australia during a visit, the whole dollar's injected into the economy, the entire dollar's profit, as another country paid for the earning of that dollar. This is sad for them, as they paid for it and saw no return. But it's great for us, as we get all of it for virtually no cost to us. Considering this factor on a more micro level, a community which attracts more than the average amount of overseas visitors is one which may benefit greatly from the tourist dollar. Remember, though, that this must be tempered against other factors which may reduce or even eliminate the benefit. Areas relying solely on the tourist dollar may experience seasonal swings in economic vibrancy and many other factors which can make buying in holiday areas a bad idea. As with all growth drivers, this one must be considered alongside all of the other features of the area. Number 7, Council Financial Health and Leadership. I've been travelling around the country for around 3 years now, examining areas for my TV show and presenting them in a segment which identifies those areas which are hotspots and those which are not spots. In doing so, I believe that I've uncovered another characteristic which, while it may not be purely economical, certainly contributes to the likelihood that an area will utilise its potential and grow to become a serious hotspot. Some of the areas which I visit definitely have some of the signs that they may become a hotspot. They have affordable housing, people are moving to the area, and the opportunity to design and implement infrastructure plans is freely available, just waiting to be taken advantage of. Yet when I speak to the mayor or the staff, it seems that no one's driving the train. Lethargy exists, and the desire to maintain the area at its present, sometimes parochial and small-town status pervades the council at every level. I recently visited 2 areas located relatively close together. Both have strong signs of potential growth with plenty of opportunity to maximise this growth with defined infrastructure plans. Prior to my visit, I had assessed both as being potential hotspots, one immediately and one in the coming 5 years or so. The mayor of the first area explained to me that they had identified that a significant proportion of their population was under 25, and as these people were their future, they needed to encourage them to stay and raise their own families. As such, Council identified their needs as more important than those of the ageing part of the community and were focusing all energies on future developments which would suit this demographic. More medium-density housing, employment projects, and the encouragement of small business ventures. Development application processes were also being streamlined to speed up new residential and commercial development and provide what was needed as quickly as possible. I left that area wishing that I owned more than one property there. The mayor of the second area spoke of the importance of not embracing change too quickly so as to preserve the charm of the area. He was unaware of the significant opportunities afforded by the coming broadband rollout, and his council had no plans around utilising that opportunity. As a resident, himself approaching retirement, he wanted to ensure that all of those features the ageing population enjoyed remained intact. When asked if plans existed to improve the development application process in response to the needs of the community, he replied, "It's not about what they want, it's about what council wants, and they must understand that we have a set process." I left and immediately reassessed my summary of that area and pushed out any potential growth by another 5 years. There's nothing wrong with an area retaining its country charm and keeping the big smoke at bay for as long as it can. However, if this is what the plan is, then there can't be any complaining when the funding for that latest transport infrastructure plan isn't forthcoming, or when the local economy stagnates and eventually shrinks to being almost non-existent. For an area to thrive, grow and prosper, its council must be open for business. The councillors must approach the task of management as if they're running a business, and they must doggedly set about bringing attention, funding and interest to their area. This requires a whole host of tasks, and such a council must start at a grassroots level. They must consider their planning processes, how to foster and encourage business growth, how to facilitate residential development and implement master planning. They have to think long-term and plan for and encourage population growth, and they must look at where they are today, where they want to be in 5 and 10 years' time, and then uncover the gaps or the barriers which stand in their way. When I come across such a council and also find that all of the necessary intrinsic growth drivers are in place, I get really excited about that area. It instills confidence in me that the facts I've uncovered about that area are most likely to be exploited and given every chance to flourish, so that area can become the hotspot that it has the potential to be. Local government is the absolute core of the economic engine of a community. It has the power to fire up that engine and be in one of the top spots at the finish line, or to crash and burn and be an also-ran. And so where do you find this information? The kind of information which I covered in this podcast comes from many sources, and your job will be to do the hard yards and try to harness it without working so hard that you wear out before you even buy property. As I've mentioned, many councils have some kind of economic brief. You can either download this from their webpage or they can post a hard copy to you. In addition, many councils also now utilise census data and display demographic information on their websites. Take care though that this data isn't too old, because census data is only collected every 5 years. Studies are often done by associations such as the Housing Industry Association, and it's useful to check in on their website from time to time. Many of these studies are done on a national or state basis though, and you'll need to try to apply it to the local areas that you're researching. A plain old Google search can usually uncover most of what you need. Always check the dates and scope of any studies you're viewing and ensure that the reported data has not simply been extrapolated from an earlier study, because this is unlikely to be accurate if this is the case. And so now you have that canvas ready to go. Of course, you're not ready yet to pounce and buy that property in the area where you found sound economic vibrancy. At this stage, all you've done is decided whether your canvas is suitable to paint a picture upon. While it's rare for a great picture to be created upon substandard materials, many a fine canvas has had a tragic mess painted upon it, so much so that the original material is lost forever. In researching this economic landscape, you've simply uncovered those areas, usually entire regions, where potential exists. Now it's time to get much deeper to allow you to decide once and for all if what you're reading economically has any chance of translating into property investing success. Now it's time for you to get out those 20 must-ask questions and begin asking them one by one. If that economically vibrant area also satisfies most of the 20 questions, then you're most likely onto a winner. Thanks for listening to this podcast, and I'll talk to you again next time.
You can register to become a VIP and hear more from Margaret through her regular monthly newsletter. Go to destiny.net.au and click on VIP to find out more.